Hey everybody, Green Films Official here. Man, it's been a while, hasn't it? Now, today is a very special video because I'm going to be analyzing one of my top 5 movies of all time, The Shining. If you're a veteran of this channel, you might be thinking, Greenie, haven't you done a video on The Shining already? And you're right, I did review The Shining and its sequel, Doctor Sleep, in this video right here. But I really only explored my general thoughts in that video, and I didn't really clarify what I found deeply special about it, which is what I aim to do with this video. I also had this to say in that video.
I am interested in doing an in-depth analysis on this movie at some point. I think it would be really interesting to discuss.
Geez, did I really used to sound like that? Anyways, enough of the chit-chat. Let's get into the analysis. The Shining is a psychological horror film based on a 1977 Stephen King novel of the same name and was released on the 13th of November 1980. It was directed by Stanley Kubrick and stars Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, Danny Lloyd, Scatman Crothers, and Philip Stone. The plot follows the Torrance family, which consists of Jack, who has been hired to be the caretaker of the Overlook Hotel over the winter, his wife Wendy, and his son Danny. Things all seem hunky-dory, but things get out of hand once malevolent forces within the hotel start encouraging Jack to kill his family. The Shining, despite its polarizing critical reception when it first came out, is not only one of the most celebrated horror movies ever, but it is also one of the most celebrated movies ever, just generally. It features some of the most iconic characters, dialogue, and horror imagery to grace the silver screen, and it is constantly referenced by other media like The Simpsons, Ready Player One, and even Get Out. It is a film so prestigious that it is preserved by the Library of Congress. Even people who don't like horror movies absolutely love The Shining. Why is that? First of all, this film is very cohesive, and I think the reason for that is that Kubrick understood what made the Chekhov's gun principle so effective. Everything established early on in the film comes back in some major way at a later point, making everything feel like it matters and has a stake in the plot. A few examples include everything Halloran explains to Danny about the titular Shining, the snowcat, the hedge maze, Jack typing what we think is his novel in the first half of the film, and, most importantly, the idea of violence. The idea of violence is brought up at so many points throughout the entire film, like Ullman's story at the start, Danny talking about cannibalism in the car and asking Jack if he'd ever hurt them in the bedroom scene. Jack even has a nightmare about killing Wendy and Danny and chopping them up into little pieces. It all foreshadows what is to come later in the film and really builds suspense. Speaking of which, the way this film builds that suspense in other ways is masterful. It takes nearly an hour into the film before threatening supernatural events start occurring, but we know something is wrong because of Danny's fear of what might be within the hotel. This makes first-time viewers who don't know anything about the plot question and fear what Danny might be seeing that his parents don't. This film also has a tendency to show the characters reacting to something before showing that something, building this feeling of dread and wonder as to what they might be looking at. Jack's descent into madness is gradual, but we get hints throughout the film that progressively get more and more intense as the film goes on, his scenes becoming more and more uneasy to watch until finally he snaps. How about I offer some disturbing food for thought? Jack was destined to turn against his family. He constantly gets into arguments with Wendy. His alcoholism has caused and later continues to cause problems in the family after he relapses. He has a history of abuse that I will discuss later. He is incredibly disloyal and perfectly okay with cheating on Wendy, as he very clearly wants to have sex with the woman in room 237, despite knowing that she isn't supposed to be there and previously harmed his son. Wendy and Danny are shown to have a great, loving relationship, as seen when they explore the hedge maze together and when they're playing in the snow. Jack, however, has a very questionable relationship with Danny. Before the events of the film, he violently pulls him up by his arm, breaking it, and during the events of the film, it's hard to know if he shows any real love towards him before snapping. The bedroom scene between the two feels so off and uncomfortable. There's something so strange about the way Jack's facial expressions look and the way he speaks to his own son in this scene. It's as if he doesn't truly mean anything he's saying, as if he's a wolf in sheep's clothing. I have a theory that the hedge maze possibly represents Jack's twisted mind. I mean, for starters, all the curls make the maze look like a brain, and at the end of the movie, Jack freezing to death in it possibly represents him losing himself because his mind has become so cold and cruel. Danny, however, is able to escape because, thanks to The Shining, he knows how his father thinks. One of the things I love most about this movie from a filmmaking standpoint is how it's shot often conveys a scene's mood and tone. Most scenes of characters doing anything from walking, talking, or throwing a ball tends to be done via a medium shot or a full shot to make us truly feel the loneliness and desolation of the hotel. When Danny is riding around the halls, the camera follows him and has the same speed and energy he does, but once the Grady twins appear, the camera stops completely, as does Danny. There's an emphasis on Danny's terrified expression with a close-up shot, whilst in the next shot the twins are filmed from a distance, conveying their unfamiliarity and keeping us in Danny's shoes as he is in the forefront. The classic "Here's Johnny" scene is another great example, as when we see Jack striking the door, the camera is at a distance from him, and the camera traces the axe as he swings it. These details make the shot feel lively and free, but by contrast, when we see Wendy's horrified reaction from within the bathroom, the camera is much closer to her and its movement is very limited, emphasizing that the space she occupies is incredibly small and that she is trapped with nowhere else to go. If you're a massive fan of The Shining, then it probably comes as no surprise to you that the Overlook Hotel is actually alive. But I feel like the film conveys this information in a much more subtle manner than the book. I mean, for starters, the book just outright tells you, but the film merely suggests it. Heartbeats can be heard in some pieces of the film's soundtrack that could belong to the Overlook. Sometimes the Overlook's layout is rather contradictory and doesn't make much sense, such as the window in Ullman's office. It's almost like the hotel is shifting, and once you realize it, it creates an uncanny feeling in a scene that otherwise appears to be normal. In the scene where Dick Halloran explains what The Shining is to Danny, he mentions that some places are like people, some shine and some don't, and that the Overlook has something about it like The Shining. Whatever could that be implying? I like this approach to the Overlook sentience much more than the books, because the subtlety really makes the hotel feel like this ancient, evil Lovecraftian horror, whose means of destruction is far more insidious and unnerving. Rather than directly attacking the family by possessing Jack like it does in the book, it slowly draws out his deepest and darkest evils. Even in a story where an eldritch terror is behind everything, the true antagonist is a hateful man's inner malevolence, which is closer to reality and therefore more frightening. Look, don't get me wrong here, I think the book's Overlook is a great villain, but it feels less Lovecraftian and more something out of an urban legend, due to it having a clear personality and being more directly involved with the plot, rather than pulling the strings behind the scenes. Even when we get a glimpse of the movie hotel's personality in Doctor Sleep, it's still not like a whole lot, certainly still less than the book. Another thing about the Overlook Hotel that just makes this film so creepy is that it's basically a perfect liminal space. Some of the best liminal space imagery in this film, at least in my opinion, includes the hallways, the hedge maze, the game room, the gold room, room 237, the red bathroom, and even the room that Jack uses as a writing office, just to name a few. But what makes these liminal spaces effective, and what makes a liminal space effective in general? I'm going to give you a definition of a liminal space, and you're probably going to judge me for my source, but it's a really good definition. According to the Aesthetics Wiki on Fandom, a liminal space is a location which is a transition between two other locations or states of being. Typically, these are abandoned and oftentimes empty, such as a mall at 4 a.m. or a school hallway during summer, for example. This makes it feel frozen and slightly unsettling, but also familiar to our minds. Many attribute the scariness of liminal spaces to the fact that so many of them seem familiar, but with something off about them, usually due to the fact that things seem distorted in some way. Maybe the proportions seem too long or stretch beyond what the eye can see, for instance. This forest picture here is a great example of what I'm talking about. I've been to many hotels in my time, so a lot about the Overlook feels familiar to me. I get a small sense of nostalgia from it, and in some ways it's almost like I've been there before. But at the same time, there's something else about it that feels strange, like the wide open spaces and the inconsistent colors, some being bright and some being dull, often within the same shot. There's also the eerie lighting present in some scenes in those hallways that seemingly stretch onwards forever, that really make it feel wrong somehow. In Yorgos Lanthimos' The Killing of a Sacred Deer, another horror film with liminal space type imagery, scenes are often shot with an abundance of space above the characters' heads, which was done for various reasons, but one of the best parts about it was how unnerving it made the movie feel. And I get a similar feeling from The Shining. Of course, there's the classic opening credit sequence, in which the music makes it feel like the point of view of some great evil looming above and observing Jack, but I also feel as though the high ceilings contribute to the uncanniness of the film's primary setting, particularly the Gold Room, which feels as eerie as it is grand in its scope. The Overlook feels so illusory, it's like looking at altered memories or like exploring something eldritch merely disguising itself as something familiar. Now look here, not all liminal space photography is necessarily meant to be frightening or unsettling. Some of it might even have a relaxing effect on you. But oftentimes you see liminal spaces in horror works such as Eraserhead or Silent Hill, not just because of their distorted visuals, but because of their emptiness and the uncomfortable feeling that that creates. Most human beings are naturally social creatures. Think about it for a second. Social interaction is key in our lives, it's literally everywhere. There's a reason why what we live in is called a society. The average individual talks with their family, their friends, their coworkers, their employees, and various other people every day. Most of us communicate with others both offline and online every single day. I'm communicating with you, the viewer, right now by presenting this information to you. People fear what they don't understand and may resort to others to feel comfort or support. And that's where the emptiness of liminal spaces becomes scary for me. For just a minute, I want you to imagine yourself being trapped and isolated in a bizarre, uncanny place that feels familiar, like you've been there before, but with the hint that something's off. It's like reality's been changed. You don't understand what this place is or why you're there, and no one can help you because there is no one else. Also, liminal space photos tend to be set in places that are normally filled to the brim with people, like the city streets during Christmas Eve, which only serves to make the emptiness even more horrifying. When places that were made for people to interact with are left abandoned, they lose their purpose and meaning and start to become abstract. There should be people who can help you, but where did they go? Terror creeps in. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It's confusion and isolation resulting in dread. Terrifying, isn't it? This exact horror can be felt in The Shining. The droning noises of the soundtrack and the stone cold atmosphere give the hotel this feeling that our main characters are trapped in a frightening alternative reality in which all other human beings have been removed. Even though that isn't the case, and we're clearly told why the hotel is empty, there's still something about being inside of it with no one else around that feels off. As I mentioned before, the use of medium and full shots provides the viewer with a strong sense of the loneliness and isolation of the hotel. All of these elements combine to create what I can only describe as one of the most horrifying aspects of the entire film. Or do they? Unlike in my hypothetical scenario I brought up earlier, the Torrances aren't an individual, they're a trio. Therefore, they're not completely alone. They have each other, right? Well, in their case, even family has its limits. Some liminal spaces can be purely psychological. Physical liminal spaces tend to be places of transition, a place between the beginning and the destination. A hotel, for instance. Psychological liminal spaces carry that tradition, but are quite different. An article by Kimberly Dawn Newman for Forbes Health states the following: Less tangible and more emotional, a psychological liminal space may be recognized as more of a life transition or shift between two ways of thinking. As a result, both experts say psychological spaces are often referred to instead as liminal states. This differentiation recognizes the mental aspects and often challenges involved with being mired between spaces. The point I'm trying to make here is basically that Wendy goes through a liminal state in which she realizes the kind of man that Jack really is, but she also desperately wants to still love him and for things to go back to normal. Well, that is, if life with Jack ever was normal. And we see the toll that this takes on her. What initially appears to and should be a normal relationship turns out to be something far darker and upsetting. And honestly, I find it pretty poetic that Wendy experiences this liminal state within a liminal space. From this movie's first act, we are shown that she finds happiness in time spent with Danny. But as the film goes on, Danny has episodes that make him extremely difficult, if not impossible, to talk to. When she tries to desperately communicate with him in one scene, he merely says, "Danny's gone away, Mrs. Torrance," with the voice of Tony, his imaginary friend. Because, well, obviously the hotel is totally desolate, the only other person she has to communicate with during these episodes is Jack, and, well, he's going completely insane, despises her, and ultimately wants to kill her, so there are numerous scenes in which she appears to be going insane herself due to a sense of helplessness and being completely deprived of normal human interaction with her own family, and it's rather disturbing to watch. Even with her family with her, Wendy has to come to terms with the fact that she is more alone than she ever was. Because of all that, the physical liminal space in this film has the exact same effect as it would if it only followed one person. You know, this film is such a masterclass of horror that it even manages to have a jump scare without being annoying. The problem with jump scares in most modern horror media isn't just their frequency, but it's also that all they have to offer is the build-up to the jump scare, and then that's it. That's the whole scene. It becomes rather numbing and predictable after a while, especially when every scene goes like this. Jack screaming before killing Halloran works as a jump scare, because jump scares aren't too common in the movie and it doesn't come last. The build-up is masterfully done, as the scene has an incredibly slow pace at first. All there is Halloran nervously moving forward and calling out for the Torrances when suddenly it happens. Jack lets out a loud guttural scream before slamming the axe into his chest. It catches the viewer off guard with an unpleasant jolt, and then it follows that up with the horrifying image of Halloran. This incredibly likable character has been nothing but kind to the Torrances, getting murdered in cold blood. After that, it ends with Jack in pure glee at the fact that he has corrected one of the Overlook's enemies. This scene is utterly ruthless, man. One of the aspects I find most interesting about this film is how it utilizes fictional horrors as a way of exploring real-life horrors. For instance, let's take a look at how the film portrays addiction. Jack is a recovering alcoholic who desperately begins wanting a drink again once things start becoming tense between him and Wendy, and as a result he is seduced by the Overlook's bar with a friendly face in the form of Lloyd, and the promise of a release from his tension in the form of alcohol. Alcohol that's free to boot.
No charge, dear Mrs. Torrance. No charge? Your money's no good here.
He goes there to calm himself down after his wild fits of rage several times throughout the film, worsening his alcoholism. The alcohol clouds his mind and makes it easier for the ghost to manipulate him into fulfilling the hotel's wishes. The same way that being under the influence of alcohol can cause people to do terrible things in, well, real life. Regardless of whether or not he's under the influence of alcohol, Jack is incredibly abusive towards his family, both physically and mentally. His physically abusive traits manifest through the fact that, well, before the film even began, he broke Danny's arm, and later, after Danny is attacked by the ghost in room 237, Wendy automatically assumes Jack was the one who did it. And I mean, surely Jack would have had to have hurt Danny repeatedly for her to assume this that quickly, right? His psychological abuse is seen throughout, like when he berates Wendy for coming to check up on him whilst riding, and during the scene where he creepily menaces her up the stairs, she actually poses more of a physical threat to him in the scene due to having a weapon, and him not having one, and yet he has all the power in the scene because of the sadistic way he gets into her head. The snow traps the family within the hotel. Jack doesn't mind being stuck in the hotel, in fact he loves it there, but Wendy and Danny do. Jack shouts at Wendy when she suggests that they leave, and even destroys the radio and Snowcat so that they can't escape. This reflects how many real-life families are trapped in these horrifyingly abusive, seemingly inescapable relationships. Perhaps snow isn't literally keeping them trapped, but other more psychological factors definitely are. The way this film touches on racism and genocide is also worth noting. I mean, for starters, Jack mentions white man's burden in Lloyd's first scene, and Jack and Grady are both incredibly racist, referring to Halloran by the N-word. Grady in particular acts as though his skin color makes him an even worse enemy to the Overlook. And the fact that the Overlook was built over American Indian resting grounds is also important. The 1920s, the time period in which the ghosts would have been alive based on the photograph at the end of the film, was the height of British imperialism. And so what the ballroom scene is showing us is quite literally a party over the graves of those who have been senselessly slaughtered, representing how little racist people in power care about the lives of people who don't look like them. During the scene with Grady, It's All Forgotten Now by Al Bowley can be heard playing in the background, possibly as a way of representing how often we forget the horrific injustices done in the past and how they've affected the present. I also feel that the ghosts themselves serve as a creative metaphor for evil in the past having a negative effect in the present. Halloran even says that when something happens it leaves a trace of itself behind, and that sometimes certain events can leave other kinds of traces behind that only people with the Shining can see. Just as people with the Shining can see things that haven't happened yet, they can see things that have already happened. For example, a ballroom party that happened in the 1920s perhaps, or the horrific murder of 2 young girls. The use of classical music by artists such as Al Bowley and Jack Hilton echoing through the Overlook's halls are another indication of the past affecting the future in some way. At least that's what I think. Now we've reached the ending. After everything this terrifying film has put us through, Wendy and Danny get away, Jack freezes to death in the hedge maze. Just when you think it's all over, the film ends with a terrifyingly evocative final image. A photograph taken in the Overlook's ballroom. In front of a sea of rich partygoers, we're faced with none other than Jack Torrance. The date on the photograph is July 4th, 1921. How is this possible? What does this ending even mean? Is it some nonsense that Stanley Kubrick put in the film just to mess with the audience? Well, no. First of all, the photograph and its importance is foreshadowed throughout as characters walk past the gold room at several points in the film, so it's not just in there for no reason. A popular theory is that whenever someone becomes corrupted by the hotel and dies in it, they're added to the photograph, indicating that they've become one of the many ghosts haunting the desolate halls, fulfilling the purposes that the hotel wants them to fulfill. Evidence of this can be seen in the 2019 sequel Dr. Sleep, in which Jack appears as a ghost in the Overlook's bar, replacing Lloyd. However, as cool as that theory is, Kubrick stated that it represents the reincarnation of Jack, and evidence of that can be found through Jack saying that he experienced deja vu from the hotel. And let's not forget, Grady quite clearly says during the bathroom scene that Jack has always been the caretaker. Some have criticized the ending, stating that it isn't really all that satisfactory, and while I could understand why someone would have that criticism to a point, I personally find that when you fully assess what is actually happening here, it isn't really supposed to be. Whilst Danny and Wendy have finally escaped the Overlook, Jack has just become a part of its cruel and evil cycle, bound to it forever and ever and ever. And that's assuming he wasn't part of it already. The photograph at the end ties into the message that unless we attempt to do something about problematic social norms, unfair privilege, abuse, alcoholism, and other issues, then history is doomed to repeat itself over and over and over again. I've also heard the argument that the more positive ending of Dr. Sleep lessens the impact of The Shining's more bittersweet ending, but I'd argue that it actually makes it stronger because it creates a strong moral question. At the end of Dr. Sleep, an adult Danny Torrance burns down the Overlook, ending its cycle of evil forever. Meanwhile, at the end of The Shining, Jack Torrance throws away everything he once loved because of his failure to resist the hotel's temptations and his own evil nature. and because of that, he becomes part of the long, seemingly endless cycle of evil. The idea of this ruthless, unending cycle is presented to us right from the start, as the story Stuart Ullman tells Jack about how Grady went crazy and murdered his family is virtually identical to what happens later in the film. As I said previously, unless human beings are willing to change, history is doomed to repeat itself. We have real issues affecting our world: class inequality, hate, corruption, war, crime, animal cruelty, abuse, and everything else you can possibly imagine. Our world needs more Danny Torrances. The question is, will we step up and become Danny Torrances and do something about all of that? Or are we just a bunch of less overt and more insidious Jack Torrances who play into all of that evil? Whew, now that was a big one. Thank you so much for reaching this point in the video. I really appreciate it. This is a video I've wanted to make for quite a while, and I've spent a while writing the script and making this video, and I hope you enjoyed. If you did, why not leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Your support really helps out, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!